Texas lawmaker tonight is looking to change abortion laws in the state. A bill filed by State Representative Brent Money would criminalize women who terminate their own pregnancies.
Money says the goal is to protect the life of unborn children, while others say it's harmful for women. KLTV's Michael Richardson reports.
Republican State Representative Brent Money is looking to extend the legal consequences for abortion not just to doctors, but to women who terminate their own pregnancies, such as by using medication. Currently, doctors who perform an abortion can face up to life in prison.
The law is about protecting babies, and the law is about teaching people what's right and wrong.
Women would not be criminally charged if an abortion is performed by a doctor to save their life or if they have a miscarriage. Money hopes the law reduces the number of abortions in the state, which, according to Texas Health and Human Services, have dropped since 2021.
And I think that over time we would see mothers and fathers taking more responsibility for their children, and we would have a culture of life that really promotes the value and glory of children.
The proposed law comes after the reversal of Roe v. Wade, which sparked protests in Texas and across the country. The Dobbs decision allowed Texas's trigger law to go into effect, limiting abortions past 6 weeks.
Implementing another bill that makes it harder for women in Texas is going to be a real problem.
Smith County Democratic Party Precinct Chair Mitzi Rusk says the law will make it more difficult to access reproductive health care.
There is no legislation that I know of that allows women to have a vote on what men do with their bodies. Texas has succeeded in limiting access to abortion in Texas. What they have failed to do is to provide for more health care for women and for more assets for children in Texas.
The bill has not yet been assigned to a committee. Michael Richardson, KLTV 7 News.
If passed, the law would take effect September 1st. It will need to clear committee.